The Whispering Grave. Nick had always felt a strange pull towards the meadow at the edge of town. It wasn't the kind of place people visited, overgrown with wildflowers and tangled weeds, bordered by ancient trees that whispered in the wind. But for Nick, an orphan who had never known the comfort of a family, it was a place of solitude, a refuge from the harsh world that had taken everything from him. On this particular night, the moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie silver light across the landscape. The meadow was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. Nick walked slowly through the tall grass, the cool night air brushing against his skin. He didn't know why he had come here so late, only that something deep inside had urged him to leave the orphanage and venture into the darkness. As he wandered, Nick's thoughts drifted to his mother, a woman he had never met, whose face he only knew from a faded photograph tucked away in a drawer at the orphanage. She had died when he was just a baby, leaving him alone in a world that seemed colder with each passing year. He often wondered what she was like, if she had loved him, if she had thought of him in her final moments. Lost in these thoughts, Nick nearly stumbled over something hidden in the grass. He stopped, peering down to see a small, weathered headstone, half buried in the earth. It was old, covered in moss and dirt, the inscription barely visible in the pale moonlight. Curiosity gnawed at him, and he knelt down to brush away the dirt, revealing a name etched into the stone. Margaret Thompson. Nick's breath caught in his throat. It was his mother's name. He recoiled, his heart pounding, but a strange compulsion drove him to lean in closer, his fingers tracing the letters as if to confirm they were real. What was her grave doing here, in this forgotten meadow? He had never been told where she was buried, never thought to ask. The orphanage had always been his entire world, and now, here she was, her grave hidden away in this desolate place. As he stared at the headstone, the wind picked up, carrying with it a sound that made Nick's blood run cold. It was faint at first, just a whisper carried on the breeze, but as he listened, the sound grew clearer, words forming in the air around him. Nick. My darling Nick. He froze, his heart thundering in his chest. The voice was soft, gentle, yet filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to echo through the night. It was a voice he had never heard before, yet it resonated within him, tugging at a buried memory he couldn't quite grasp. Nick. Please. He stumbled back, his eyes wide with terror. The voice was coming from the grave, from beneath the earth itself. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible, but there was no denying what he had heard. Mom, he whispered, his voice trembling. There was no reply, only the rustling of the wind through the grass. But Nick couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was watching him, waiting for him to do something. The air around him felt heavy, oppressive, as if the entire meadow was holding its breath. He wanted to run, to get as far away from this place as possible, but his feet felt rooted to the ground. The grave seemed to pulse with an energy that drew him in, even as every instinct screamed at him to flee. And then, the voice came again, louder this time, more insistent. Nick. Come closer. The words wrapped around him, pulling him forward, against his will. His hands shook as he reached out, his fingers brushing the cold stone. The earth beneath him seemed to shift, the ground growing soft and unsteady, as if something was trying to claw its way to the surface. Nick's heart pounded in his chest as he realized he wasn't alone in the meadow. Something was down there, beneath the dirt, beneath his mother's grave, and it wanted him. It wanted him to join it. Nick ran from the meadow as fast as his legs could carry him, his heart pounding in his chest, the eerie whisper of his mother's voice still echoing in his ears. By the time he reached the orphanage, the first light of dawn was just beginning to creep over the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard. He slipped inside, his breath ragged, and collapsed onto his bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what had happened. Sleep never came. Instead, Nick spent the entire day restless, haunted by the memory of the voice calling to him from the grave. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that his mother was reaching out to him, trying to tell him something. But why had her grave been hidden away in that forgotten meadow? And why had no one ever told him about it? As soon as the other orphans and the staff began their morning routines, Nick set out to find answers. He searched through every record he could find at the orphanage, combing through dusty files and forgotten ledgers, but there was no mention of his mother, no clue as to where she might have been buried. Frustration gnawed at him. He asked the older children if they knew anything, but they only shook their heads, giving him puzzled looks. The staff, too, were of no help, dismissing his questions with shrugs and vague reassurances. It was as if Margaret Thompson had never existed, as if she had been erased from the world the moment she had died. Nick's desperation grew as the day wore on. He wandered through town, stopping anyone who might have known his mother, but every inquiry was met with the same confusion and indifference. By the time the sun began to set, Nick was no closer to finding the truth. Exhausted and defeated, he returned to the orphanage, his mind racing with fear and uncertainty. Night fell, and with it, the memories of the previous night came flooding back. The pull towards the meadow returned, stronger this time, an irresistible force that tugged at his very soul. Despite his fear, Nick knew he couldn't ignore it. He needed to go back, to find out what his mother's voice had been trying to tell him. When the orphanage grew quiet, Nick crept out of bed, slipping silently into the night. The moon hung high in the sky, its pale light guiding his steps as he made his way back to the meadow. The wind was still, the trees standing like silent sentinels as he approached the spot where he had found the grave. It was there, just as he had left it, the name Margaret Thompson barely visible on the weathered stone. Nick hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't want to hear the voice again, didn't want to feel the cold dread that had gripped him the night before. But he had to know, he had to understand what was happening. "Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the stillness of the night. "Are you here?" For a moment, there was nothing. The meadow was silent, the only sound the distant rustling of leaves. Nick's breath caught in his throat as he waited, every nerve on edge. And then, the whisper came again, soft and sorrowful. "Nick, my darling, why did you leave me?" Nick's heart twisted with pain at the sound of his mother's voice. "I didn't mean to, Mom. I've been looking for you, trying to find out where you are." The voice grew stronger, more urgent. "I'm here, Nick. I'm always here, waiting for you. Please, come closer." Nick stepped forward, the ground beneath him shifting slightly as he approached the grave. The voice seemed to wrap around him, pulling him in, filling his mind with a strange, overwhelming compulsion to obey. "Mom, I don't understand," Nick said, his voice trembling. "Why are you here? Why haven't I been told where you were buried?" "Because they didn't want you to find me," the voice whispered, its tone darkening with a hint of anger. "They didn't want you to know the truth, Nick. But you found me. You found me." Nick shivered, the cold night air seeping into his bones. "What truth? What are you talking about?" Before the voice could answer, the ground beneath Nick's feet shifted again, more violently this time. He stumbled, trying to keep his balance, but something was wrong. The earth seemed to be alive, churning and heaving as if something was moving beneath it. Suddenly, the dirt at his feet erupted, and before Nick could react, something shot out of the ground. Something long and thin, covered in dirt and grime, with sharp, jagged claws at the end. It wrapped around his ankle, its grip like iron, and pulled. Nick screamed, his hands clawing at the ground as he tried to free himself, but the thing beneath the earth was too strong. It yanked him down with terrifying force, dragging him towards the open grave. He kicked and thrashed, his heart pounding in his chest, but the clawed hand only tightened its grip, pulling him closer to the gaping hole. "Mom, help me!" he cried out, his voice raw with terror. But the only reply was the voice, now twisted and malevolent, echoing from the depths of the grave. "Join me, Nick. Come to me." With one final, desperate pull, the clawed hand yanked Nick off his feet, dragging him down into the darkness below. The last thing he saw before the earth closed over him was the night sky, the stars disappearing one by one as he was swallowed by the grave. Nick tumbled through the earth, the darkness around him suffocating and endless. His mind spun with terror as he fell deeper and deeper into the black abyss, the world above slipping further out of reach. The clawed hand around his ankle never loosened its grip, dragging him down, down into the cold, unforgiving ground. Suddenly, with a bone-jarring thud, he hit solid ground. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and for a moment, Nick lay there, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The air was thick and heavy, filled with the stench of damp earth and something far more foul, something that smelled of decay and death. Nick pushed himself up on trembling hands, his eyes straining to see in the pitch blackness. He was in a narrow, suffocating tunnel, the walls pressing in on him from all sides. The only sound was his own ragged breathing, echoing off the damp, dirt-covered walls. As he struggled to his feet, something in the darkness shifted, a low, guttural growl that sent a shiver down his spine. Nick froze, his blood turning to ice as he realized he wasn't alone. "Who's there?" he whispered, his voice trembling. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from the shadows ahead, a pair of glowing red eyes flickered to life, piercing the darkness like twin embers. They stared at Nick with a malevolent intensity, and the growl deepened, reverberating through the tunnel like the rumble of distant thunder. Nick's breath caught in his throat as the figure stepped forward, emerging from the shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, twisted limbs that scraped against the walls as it moved. Its skin was pale and mottled, stretched tight over bones that jutted out at unnatural angles. Long, filthy hair hung in tangled clumps around its face, and its mouth twisted into a grin that revealed rows of sharp, blackened teeth. But it was the eyes, those burning, hateful eyes, that filled Nick with the most terror. They were empty, soulless, yet filled with a hunger that made his skin crawl. The figure moved closer, each step slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. Nick tried to back away, but the tunnel was too narrow, the walls too close. He could feel the cold, damp earth pressing against his back, trapping him as the creature approached. "Stay back!" Nick cried, his voice cracking with fear. The figure didn't stop. It reached out with one long, clawed hand, the nails clicking against the walls as it advanced. The air grew colder, the foul stench intensifying as the figure drew nearer, its grin widening as it bared its teeth in a horrific, mocking smile. Nick's heart raced, his mind screaming for him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The figure loomed over him now, its shadow swallowing him whole. The claws were just inches from his face, the smell of decay so strong that it made him gag. And then it spoke. "Nick!" it hissed, its voice a low, rasping whisper that seemed to crawl into his ears and take root in his brain. "You shouldn't have come here." The sound of his name on those rotting lips sent a jolt of fear through Nick's body, freezing him in place. How did this thing know his name? How did it know anything about him? The figure's grin widened, and it leaned in closer, its breath hot and rancid against Nick's skin. "You're just like her, Nick, so curious, so desperate to know the truth." Nick's eyes widened in horror. "What are you talking about? What truth?" The figure chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down Nick's spine. "You'll find out soon enough. Just like she did." The claws reached out, and before Nick could react, they wrapped around his wrist, cold and unyielding. The figure's grip was like iron, crushing his bones, pulling him closer. Nick struggled, panic surging through him, but it was no use. The figure was impossibly strong, dragging him deeper into the tunnel, deeper into the darkness. As Nick fought against the creature's hold, his foot caught on something protruding from the ground, a small, half-buried object that sent him sprawling onto the dirt floor. The figure's grip tightened, but for a moment, Nick's hand was free, and he grabbed at the object in desperation. It was a small, weathered headstone, just like the one he had seen in the meadow. Nick's blood ran cold as he wiped away the dirt and saw his own name etched into the stone. Nick Thompson. The air left his lungs in a choked gasp. The date of his death was carved beneath his name, the very night he had first heard his mother's voice. No, this isn't real. This can't be happening," Nick whispered, his voice trembling with terror. The figure let out a low, mocking laugh, its claws digging into Nick's flesh as it pulled him closer. "Oh, it's very real, Nick. You were marked the moment you heard her voice. Just like she was." Nick's mind raced, the horror of the situation crashing down on him like a tidal wave. He was trapped, caught in a nightmare that had no escape. The figure's claws tightened around him, pulling him closer to its rotting, grinning face. As the figure leaned in, its breath rancid and cold, Nick's gaze darted to the headstone, then back to the creature. What are you?" The creature's grin widened, its teeth glinting in the dim light. "I'm the one who comes for those who seek the truth, Nick. The one who drags them down, into the dark, into the earth, where they belong." With a final brutal yank, the figure pulled Nick down into the cold, damp earth. The darkness swallowed him whole. The last thing he saw was the figure's burning eyes, and the sound of its laughter echoed in his ears. And on the surface, in the quiet meadow, two gravestones now stood side by side, one for Margaret Thompson and one for her son, Nick. The earth settled over them, the night air still and silent, as if nothing had ever happened. But deep beneath the ground, In the cold, dark tunnel, the terrible figure held its prize close, grinning with satisfaction as it claimed yet another soul.